Hi, my name is Michael McCauley. This is History for Thinkers. Welcome to part number 3 of the Mein Kampf analysis series, where we are basically reading through Mein Kampf and talking about some of the interesting quotes and passages. Now, I strongly encourage you to start with episode 1 and watch it all the way through, because that's normally the best way to do it. You get the best feel of the book that way, but we are on episode 3, so if you want to just keep watching, go on ahead. Now, I also do want to make a correction. In the last video, I talked about the translation that I was using. Now, this is actually the Ralph Manheim translation, not whatever it is that I said last time. Ralph Manheim is, his translation of Mein Kampf is the most scholarly cited. It's also one of the most popular anyway. So just to be clear about what translation I'm using, you can check that out on Google. I'm not going to have an affiliate link because I don't want to make money from doing this. Now, with all that out of the way, let's just get into the analysis. So here's a really interesting little paragraph where he talks about the nationalizing of a people. And he really kind of goes on and makes the argument that it's about getting this person to feel connected to the nation in which they belong. And I think this last little part summarizes it really well. I can fight only for something that I love. I can love only what I respect. And in order to respect a thing, I must at least have some knowledge of it. So in Hitler's eyes, right here, he is making the argument that in order to have a fully functional nationalized person, right, like on the individual basis, these individual humans need to feel connected to the nation state in order for them to be like whole or complete. Like otherwise they're just useless. If they're not fighting for the collective, well, what good are they? What use do they have if they're not fighting for our collective group? And it's really interesting too because, some parts that, like if you just take little snippets and passages, you can almost make it sound good. But when you really think about the argument that he's making, for only when family upbringing and school education have inculcated in the individual a knowledge of the cultural and economic and above all the political greatness of his country, education of individuals is good, but only so far as they become political pawns that I can exploit, that us as the state, as the people that control the nation, like where we can control those people. That's what education is for. And I'd hate to break it to him, but that is not really education. That is brainwashing. And this is something you're going to notice a lot throughout a book like Mein Kampf, or anyone that belongs to one of these crazy ideologies. They have a completely warped understanding of what even basic words, which is why it's so difficult to have a conversation with someone that buys into some of this stuff. Because you say a word like education, and people like us, right, like normal, not radicalized people, we think of like, okay, learning a trade, getting, understanding philosophy, maybe self-knowledge, right, for education. Well, someone like Hitler, he hears that and he thinks, oh, do they feel an allegiance to the nation state of which they are a citizen of? That's not education. So just down on a basis, the words, the definitions of those words, we don't even agree. So I think that's part of the reason that it's really easy for people like Nazis and communists to just, like there's no discussion with people that are not in your camp. There's only terrorism against people who are not in your camp. Because how can you have a conversation when just such a basic word like education, and there are many more examples, but when you disagree on such fundamental definitions, how can you communicate with people? It's just not possible. So he talks about these kinds of people that read all the time. They're just complete bookworms. They're always consuming information from page to page, book to book. And it's really fascinating because he attacks these people as not able to distinguish between, right, what is useless, what is practical, what is worth knowing in these books. That is what is important. You're not just reading to let's memorize everything we can, which I think is actually a surprisingly practical approach to reading. And again, I think it kind of goes back to the way he views history as well. It's not so much about memorizing everything that you absolutely can. Like, what good is that? It's about reading and understanding and then being able to extract information that matters from that. And I think part of, this group of people who all they do is read and they don't ever really learn anything, I think that is something that is just constant. There's always going to be people like that where they just want to get smarter, but they can't quite decipher what is useful and useless knowledge. So there you go. And then he even said, I actually like this quote a lot. Reading is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And this is just such weird, like the way he writes this book is so strange. And you don't even realize the nuance until you actually sit down and read it. So he's going on about like reading and, self-knowledge, very modestly says, I was fortunate to have good memory and intelligence, very modest. But he goes from talking about reading and all that, then talking about Marxism. And then it's like back to this like anti-social democracy rant. Like there is just such a weird struggle. I actually think he just wanted to ramble on. Like he was just like, because I know he had a good chunk of this book dictated. So he was just kind of rambling on about politics and his life and, whatever else. While I think it was Emil Morris or Rudolf Hess, one of those guys, they just sat down and wrote the whole thing out as he was going along. So, and it really does feel that way. I mean, I wish I was fluent enough in German to be able to read it and see exactly, right? Because I think we lose some of that with the English translation, as good as it is. But I just think there's an element of that is lost. Now, he talks a little bit about the Social Democratic Party. So that was the really far left party that existed during this time in places like Germany, the Austrian Empire, I think a couple other European nation states as well. And part of the reason that it was so problematic was because it had they were not actually social democrats. They were like straight up Marxists. Like they couldn't create a communist party, so they just created the Social Democratic Party, basically the same thing. And they had some power and prestige going on in the Austrian Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire where Hitler lived. And he talks about how, it was really popular with the Slavs. So I think you can really begin to see how like a leftist political party playing up the support of, one of the ethnic minorities within that nation state probably contributed a good chunk to why Hitler did not believe Slavs and Germans could coexist peacefully. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Hitler was probably not surprised that the first communist state in existence, the Soviet Union, was Slavic. That probably did not surprise him because he just kind of thought that they were like this lesser race and they were prone to being manipulated and fooled by, you guessed it, the Jews. So he talks a little bit about being a worker and overhearing communists and social democrats wanting to organize, to unionize, to, just spreading propaganda for the Marxist cause. And this is kind of what he says. So everything was disparaged. The nation, because it was held to be an invention of the capitalist class. How often I had to listen to that phrase. The fatherland, because it was held to be an instrument in the hands of the bourgeoisie for the exploitation of the working masses. The authority of the law, because that was a means of holding down the proletariat. Religion as a means of doping the people so as to exploit them afterwards. Morality as a badge of stupid and sheepish docility. There was nothing that they did not drag in the mud. So he is very staunchly anti-Marxist. And this is why I cannot help but to be a little baffled when people try to make the argument that Nazis and communists are the same thing. They're just there is some overlap. Yes, let's not deny that. There are certain things about their ideology. They're both collectivist. They're both pro-state. And there are a lot of other things you can say. But these are just like a handful of things that like a Nazi hears from the communists and thinks, oh my God, what crazy people, right? Like, I mean, and I think most people can understand how it is kind of nonsense, soulless rhetoric. I mean, I almost think it's a little funny. There's this one part, the nation, because it was held to be an invention of the capitalist class. He's like, in parentheses, how often I had to listen to that phrase. Like, it's almost kind of funny. I find a little humor in that. And then a big chunk of Hitler's self-education. Again, he's like some, homeless, just low working class guy just trying to take odd jobs. He mentioned somewhere throughout here that around 1910 or so, he was at least not starving anymore. But he talks about the big thing that that gets him excited to read more books and more pamphlets is to argue politics with people on like lunch breaks and stuff. So like he's the guy. It's like, so you just have to imagine a bunch of communists and then Hitler. They're all working in the same factory or whatever it is. And they go on lunch break and they're just screaming at each other politics and stuff. I mean, he even mentions here that, he got better and better by the day to the point where he was a better arguer, right? He was better at debating them. And then he was like, well, they threatened to throw me from the scaffolding, so I left. How richer, however, by inexperience. So there you have it. I guess you can understand why he hated the communists so much. When you have those personal experiences, I mean, like that, when a group of communists are like, yeah, we're going to beat you up and throw you from the roof, man. I guess it's understandable to have such an aversion. Especially because, I mean, you don't think about it, but so much of our political opinions and perceptions are just the manifestations of our own experiences. If you have a good relationship with the state, you're not ever going to be a revolutionary. You're not going to stand for some kind of like big revolt or anything. But I mean, the people who are standing for revolt and trying to start a revolution, there are people that are otherwise dispossessed. This is why revolutionary politics so often preaches to the lowest classes of people, because those are the people that are they just don't have anything to lose, right? If things get worse for everybody, well, you're just down here with me in the mud, right? Like that's why communism tends to just be very bad for upper class people, and which is why like the richer you are, the more right leaning you tend to become, because you have more to lose. So anyway, little side rant over. We'll continue with the analysis. So he has this big couple of pages here where he's talking about his relationship with the Social Democratic Party. And what's really interesting to point out, because I think this is just really worth talking about, Hitler and his tactics with the Nazi Party almost mirrored what the communists were doing. There were so few original thoughts that went on with the Nazi Party that it is like astounding. I mean, they stole so much of their stuff. He's talking about probing into books and newspapers and studying the teachings of social democracy. And I think this is probably where he kind of got a blueprint for what he was going to later do after the war. Because when you have like a deep foundational understanding of the way one party does it, well, you can then go out and, put that into practice. So this is where some of the things that he was talking about before become dangerous, right? Because he just said earlier, not that many pages ago, that reading is a means to an end, to extract useful practical knowledge and wisdom or like whatever else. So he's reading these books and he's not absorbing it as propaganda, but he is looking at what they do, what the writers do, the publishers, what the social democrats do to encourage the masses to support their party. And there are so many examples of the Nazis just straight up stealing stuff. I think a really interesting one is how the Nazis, they called each other comrades, right? Like that was a really common thing. Straight up stole it from the communists. The communists were the actual people who started calling each other comrades, right? The comrade of the working class. Well, the Nazis just came along and were like, hey, listen, man, we're comrades. It is just so... looking back, I'm glad we are far enough removed that we can kind of laugh about it, because it is kind of interesting. But it's just so crazy. I can't imagine living through some of this. Christ, man, how lucky we are. But they stole things like, comrade. They used the same colors half the time. There were just a bunch of other little examples in tactics. But we can probably do a whole video presentation on that. And maybe I will someday. I think here's probably one of the most important paragraphs in this entire book. And this is what he learned from the Social Democratic Party. These tactics are based on an accurate estimation of human frailties and must lead to success, with almost mathematical certainty, unless the other side also learns how to fight poison gas with poison gas. The weaker natures must be told that here it is a case of to be or not to be. People and their weak natures must be told that you are with me or you are against me. You either stand for this, our cause, or not. If you're not my friend, you're my enemy. And he puts that into practice with the Nazi Party with deadly ramifications. Deadly. Because, I think another thing that is just appalling about what went on was how even inside the Nazi Party, even if you were you're friends with Hitler, you're a big-time Nazi official, even then you were not safe. If you were even mistrusted a little bit, you could end up dead. Right when they took power. So in 1933, they took power of the government. And then, I think it was the year after, 1934, when they had the Night of the Long Knives, and they just killed everyone they didn't like. Hundreds of people, big leadership guys inside the Nazi Party. The kind of people that I think were the more reasonable bunch inside of the Nazi Party. The people that, or even some of the people that were a little bit more, they emphasized the socialist aspect of the National Socialist Party. Those people were just murdered. Murdered. And it's because of internalizing an ideology like this, right? Fight poison gas with poison gas. Any means necessary. The ends justify the means. That's the danger of an ideology like this. And then the very next line. I also came to understand that physical intimidation has its significance for the mass as well as the individual. Here again, the socialists had calculated accurately on the psychological effect. Physical intimidation. Now, a really important idea that the Nazis had, which I think is one of the big things that separated them, it's kind of the way they conceptualized the leftist politics, whether they were, social democrats or Marxists or whatever else. There were the false leaders, typically the Jews, right? This false leader class of people, the communist revolutionaries, in the minds of the Nazis, pretty much always Jews. And weirdly enough, there is some truth to that, although, that's a long discussion that we can have. But there was a lot of Jewish leadership in leftist political parties back then. But he distinguishes between those people who are leading the victims astray. The working class people, especially like the German working class people. I mean, he sees someone that's ethnically German, like let's say an Austrian citizen, and he sees them, they get tricked into believing the false leaders and the communist doctrine and leftist politics. They become a member and a supporter of the Social Democratic Party. And they've just been led astray. They've been fooled. They've been duped into serving an ideology and a political cause that is ultimately bad for them. And it just really serves to increase the power of these false leaders. So that is the way the Nazis see the communists. And then he even kind of blames the bourgeoisie, who took a stand against the Social Democratic Party, but they ultimately led more and more people to supporting the communists because, well, they took a definite stand against even the most legitimate human demands of the working class, which typically did happen when the Industrial Revolution came. There were these people who, and let's give credit where credit is due, something as new and revolutionary as the Industrial Revolution, complete change in society, technology, everything. Factories are a thing now. They weren't around a generation ago. All of a sudden, this new stuff is around. You take your wealth, you take a bet, you create jobs, you do all this stuff, you make a factory, and, well, you've risked everything and now you're successful. But what happens, though, is because this was such a new way society was organized, they basically abused the working class, which is why the sympathies for communism were so high in the 20th century. I mean, people really were abused. I mean, 16-hour days, 7 days a week, having child labor. I mean, it's really easy to see stuff like that and be like, well, this is all going on. These rich people, they're just getting richer off of the backs of all of the working class. We're barely making enough to live. And the government is complacent with it. So you can really understand how someone can fall down the rabbit hole of Marxism during that time. And I think Hitler pretty accurately calls this out as the stupidity of the bourgeois parties, the people who represent these business owners. They just made all these short-sighted refusals to improve the labor conditions for the people. I mean, if you had just given these people a little bit, maybe not 16-hour days, maybe just 10, like bring it down a little bit, man. You don't even have to go all the way down to 8. Even then, you could have probably stopped a lot of people from becoming communists. And this is actually where we get to a point where Hitler says that he changed his opinion on something. I don't see exactly where he said that, but he mentions the trade union question. And he talks about how the Social Democratic Party, they took advantage of the trade question, or the trade union question, and they were able to exploit that as an instrument to really advance their own agenda. Where the bourgeois parties, the people representing the business owners, they just thought that they could veto and stop the logical development of something that was coming anyway. So he mentions that at first he had an attitude that, well, they're just part of the Social Democratic Party. Well, he kind of hints that he changes his mind later on and sees the trade unions not as something inherently bad, but something that can be used for good. Now, again, this is Hitler's definition of good, so maybe not exactly good as we might understand it, but yeah. Now, what's interesting is he starts talking about the Jews here, and he even mentions how his father, who was like on the extreme end of conservative, he would hear someone use the word Jew as derogatory or in some kind of negative way, and even his father would have thought that these guys were just uneducated reactionaries. Like, what's your problem, man? You got a problem with the Jews? What are you, some uneducated reactionary? Now, what's really interesting is he has this little paragraph here where he talks about being in school and knowing a Jewish boy. And he mentions that everyone was kind of on guard with being in relation to him. You know, like, oh, who knows with him, man. But other than that, he seemed like a pretty good guy. I mean, he even mentions that he formed no particular opinion in regard to this Jewish kid. So it's not like it was this lifelong hatred. Now, what's interesting about this one Jewish boy is who that one Jewish boy may have been. So I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with the work of Ludwig Wittgenstein, but he was a really great philosopher. He has some really great stuff. I'm not going to walk you through a whole bunch on him, but he actually went to school, or the same school as Hitler, and may have known him. There's even like a picture of Hitler when he was a kid in school, and it's like people have circled this other kid and say, oh, it may have been Ludwig Wittgenstein in there with the same picture. It's not really confirmed, but we do know that they went to the very same school, which is crazy. Which, like, that's just one of those like historical things. Like, what? Like, two fairly well-known German people went to the same... I don't know. I just think it's kind of cool. And I wanted to mention it because I don't think enough people know about it. And if you're wondering, during World War II, he went over to the British side. I actually think he was a British citizen, or like he was over there for a little while. Not going to read the Wikipedia page because we're already too off topic. Let's just continue. And in this little Jewish part of this book where he's kind of talking about his first impressions of them, he's like, well, I just kind of saw them as people of a different faith and not necessarily, someone worthy to be attacked, right? On the grounds of human tolerance, right? Well, it's just weird. I think if I were him, I probably would have framed it this very same way, because it just makes, like, listen, man, I thought that they were decent people. I wanted to be their friends. Like, I thought no different of them than I did anyone of a different religion. But then, they show their true color, right? Like that part's just coming in a minute, but we just know where that's going. Now, I think on this anti-Semitic section, he talks about how he's going through this transformation where he starts out as someone that doesn't really know anything about the Jews, but doesn't feel any animosity towards them, on the basis of religion at least. Well, he kind of talks about going from that to wondering, well, are these people Germans? Are Germans Jews? Like what is going on here? Why is there even this difference? Is it really just about religion? Well, he mentions buying a couple of anti-Semitic newspapers and pamphlets for the first time. And as he's reading them, he's like, I kind of became doubtful about it. I didn't really think that there was anything to this Jewish question. He said, the statements made were partly superficial and the proofs extraordinarily unscientific. And this is such a weird thing to read. I mean, like, listen, if you can make a scientific argument here, we can do whatever we want, be as anti-Semitic as you'd like. But listen, man, if you can't be scientific about it, forget about it. I'm not on board with this. And also, there's an underlying implication that when Hitler and the Nazi Party, they start publishing anti-Semitic literature, it isn't superficial and their proofs are scientific. Such a weird thought to have, but I guess it is what it is. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. This has been Michael McCauley at History for Thinkers. I will see you in the next one. Peace out.